Vance Holliday. I'm having you back on the podcast to talk about your new paper. Before I had you on, I'll call this the second round interview because I had you on earlier to talk about the younger dryas impact hypothesis. And from there, I kind of was interested in like late Pleistocene climate change in general. And I eventually got to talk to some people who worked on the White Sands footprints on the group that is kind of I guess the skeptical camp, like Dave Rochelle and Lauren Davis, in a subsequent interview. And I don't know if you had seen those.
No, as far as I know, nobody else has worked out there on the tracks specifically.
Okay. And so you have written this new paper in Science Advances and just came out June 2025. I've been reviewing it, where you went out and actually did some independent stratigraphic dating of the footprints. And the title of this paper is Paleo Lake Geochronology Supports Last Glacial Maximum Age for Human Tracks at White Sands, New Mexico. And it's you and some of your colleagues. So it's Vance Holliday et al. And yeah, that's why I wanted to bring you on right away while it's fresh to talk about this. As my background is lake sediments, and so and coring. Yeah.
Wow. You should be out there with us.
Maybe one day I'll join you. Really, I would love to go check it out down there. And so I kind of have a special perspective, I would say, more so than other people. And so I just wanted to kind of go over the details of what you did in your new study, let you talk about it and what you did and what you wrote and why you feel as though this supports the original dating of the footprints for those that are unaware, and this is the first time seeing this, by Bennett et al. In 2021. Bennett et al. 2021 in Science put forth the results in that footprints dated to 20 to 23,000 years ago could be found in White Sands, New Mexico, using Rupia seed dates, radiocarbon dates. And so your work in 2025 is supporting that. There's been some back and forth. It is a very complicated discussion. And I've been trying to follow the details of every subsequent paper because, as you know, there's been a bunch overall. This new one, though, please, could you tell us what you did in your paper? Maybe give us a nutshell.
Sure. Now, one thing I should mention on the dating, there was a follow-up paper by Pagatti et al. In 2023 where they dated pollen because of some of the criticisms that came out after the 2021 paper, some of the critiques. They followed up with dating pollen from the same levels that had the Rupia. And that dating and some luminescence dating supported the original Rupia dates. So a little background. I first started working at White Sands in 2012. But ironically, I was invited to come out to look at some tracks that had some old dates. Now, I'm not a track expert, but in any case, I was invited to come out. And as it happened, this was within a few hundred yards out of the whole basin, was within a few hundred yards of where the tracks ultimately were found. What we saw on that first visit, again, I'm not a track person, but it turned out those were giant ground sloth tracks. They weren't human.
Okay.
There's a long history of giant ground sloth tracks being mistaken for human. In any case, then also by absolute coincidence, just to the north on the Missile Range, on White Sands Missile Range, just north of the park, there were some trenches open. And we looked at them. It was the first stratigraphic work I'd ever done out there, the first radiocarbon sample I ever collected by absolute serendipity was just a few hundred yards from where the human tracks turned out. And then in 2018, again, some trenches appeared on the Missile Range. I think this was all U.S. Department of Agriculture soil trenches. I don't know. I never found out. But there were some bigger trenches in the same area. And we did some more work and collected more radiocarbon samples. And the dates we got were on Rupiah, but also on just muds,
Mm-hmm.
wetland muds.
Mm-hmm.
And they all look pretty good. And then the tracks were found. That was the initial discovery was 2019, and then the excavations were in early 2020, just before COVID hit. And I wasn't out there at the time, but I went out. In fact, I went out the day COVID closed the world down, March 12th.
Okay.
I, by pure coincidence, had a field trip out there and saw the tracks and saw the stratigraphy and realized what I'd seen a few hundred yards away, it all fit. And they didn't have their dates back yet on the tracks, but I already had based on the dates I had a pretty good idea of how old they were going to be. And in
Okay.
fact, all of their dates and the few dates I had, they fit very nicely. I had dates on these wetland muds, however, in addition to Rupiah, and then subsequently pollen. So right away, we already had 3 different sources of carbon for radiocarbon dating that all fit, but none of that came up in all the back and forth. Most of the debate has been over dating Rupiah.
Yeah.
Tangentially, people have brought up the pollen dating as well, but what I focused on was dating more wetland deposits. So then what happened, what led to that, again, by coincidence, about a mile to the north, a much younger archaeological site, archaic in the parlance. This site's about 8,800 years old. Very unusual. That's a whole nother story. Really cool site. Very rare kind of site for the Southwest. In any case, I was out there looking at it with a student, and it was buried in the dunes. It was actually being exposed in a remnant of the White Sands dunes field. And so we started wandering around and began to realize that below us on an escarpment, there were lake beds that had never been documented. This is a part of the missile range that nobody had done any work on. So we started pursuing that. Now, I'll back up.
Mm-hmm.
The tracks and this escarpment we worked on, they're all exposed in the same part of the landscapes. There was a Paleo Lake Otero, and then when it dried out, it's not clear when that happened, but let's pick a round number, 12,000 years ago, maybe 10,000 years ago. When it dried out, it began to erode, to deflate.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of gypsum in that lake, and a lot of that gypsum ended up as the world's biggest gypsum dune field. Okay, so that
Hence
erosion
the
left
name White Sands.
white sands. It's because
Yes. Hence the
it's
name,
gypsum sand. There's hardly a bit of quartz out there.
which is really weird for
It is the
geology.
world's biggest gypsum dune field. It's gorgeous. So that erosion left an escarpment all the way around the erosional basin. Okay, so it's kind of like a cake pan. And so you have this erosional basin and then a wall of sorts all the way around. So where the human tracks were found was along that escarpment. And then where we were subsequently working about a mile to the north was the same escarpment. And it's about the only place you could see anything, because either it's gone where it's been eroded or it's buried by the world's biggest pile of gypsum sand. So we have this relatively narrow window along the escarpment. So we did first some coring and got good results, lake beds and wetland muds. So the lake beds are pale olive green and the wetland muds are black to dark gray. And then we eventually opened some trenches. So what ended up happening is, between the original work by the track group in the park, and that included the U.S. Geological Survey Radiocarbon Lab. Between their work on Rupiah seeds and pollen, and then all of what I had on wetland muds, there was a total of about 55 radiocarbon dates on 3 different kinds of material. In other words, 3 different sources of carbon determined by 3 different labs, and it all matches up. The stratigraphy in the field matches up. physically, you could trace, I was able to trace several of the layers from the track area all the way to where we're working, where we did all our trenching and coring. Literally, you could walk along the escarpment and trace some of the beds. So the stratigraphic correlation is ironclad. You can literally put your hands on it where it's not covered by some sand and trace it. And we've got both groups have roughly a couple of dozen radiocarbon dates, and everything fits rather remarkably. As a matter of fact, it's about as good a radiocarbon sequence as I've ever seen through space and time, stratigraphically from site to site, and then through time vertically in the stratigraphic sequence. And the part that overlaps, the track stratigraphy that we could trace into the lake and wetland stratigraphy, our dating fits the original dating. And then where I was working, we actually have a longer sequence. It begins at about 23,000, more than 23,000. It goes up to about 17,000. And it's about 4 meters, 4 meters thick. And then where the tracks are is a subset of that stratigraphy. Their section is like 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters thick, and covers, as you mentioned, the interval from 23,000 up to 21,000.
Okay.
So our sequence spans more time, but it fits very well with the original dating. So that's the basic story. And
Yeah.
so, and then the other part of that I should mention too, this is the archaeology side of things. When the original discovery was made, when it was originally published, archaeologist colleagues, the first question they had is, where were people living? Where are the archaeological sites?
Yeah.
And I had no idea because nobody had worked out the paleo landscape story. All we knew initially is where the people were walking around, the original discovery, are stream deposits. They're not lake beds. They're mainly stream deposits with some interfingering lake beds. And that was one of the arguments to support the dating, is that the original dating is that the water it's fresh water coming off the mountains to the east and then coming out onto a stream bed that's flowing out into the lake. And part of the issue is whether the rapia was taking up old water,
Yeah. Dead
so-called,
carbon.
with old
Yeah.
carbon,
Yeah.
or what it looked like to us, it's fresh water, and therefore this old water issue is a non-issue. And then our work on most of our dating was on wetland deposits. We got a few more rapia dates, but it's mainly wetland deposits, and it all fits very nicely.
Okay. I guess I want to take this conversation in two directions. One is I have a couple technical questions I want to ask you about the dating and the context and OSL, but I feel like we've covered a lot of technical stuff right now, and I kind of want to let's step back and let's just do a couple broad questions here, because I think for people that are maybe not aware of the history of humanity or human migration into the Americas, they may not be aware that, right now the oldest, I guess, accepted date for humans in the Americas comes from like the coast of the Baja Peninsula, places like Cooper's Ferry, and these are dated to like 16,000 years ago, roughly speaking, with air. So to propose in White Sands, New Mexico, that these footprints are 20 to 23,000 years old is what I would call or term a extraordinary claim. and I'm sure you're well aware of that as well, because that kind of turns a lot of the story on its head, because first of all, New Mexico's not on the coast, and it's preceding coastal sites in its age. And like you just mentioned, very little evidence, archaeologically speaking, in the Otero Basin itself. Not that the absence doesn't indicate anything, but just right now, there's very little evidence. There may be in the future. So making this claim by Bennett and your co-authors and Pagadi it is an extraordinary claim for the audience. And that's why you're getting in papers like Science, Science Advances, Paleo America, because this is a big finding. If this dating is true, and you're saying you have 50 different dates that are all pointing towards these footprints in New Mexico being 20 to 23,000 years old. So we're pushing you and your co-authors are pushing the dating back, what, 4 to 7,000 years as it currently stands. So I think it is warranted that if you're making an extraordinary claim, you have to provide extraordinary evidence, which now with how many papers, I think you're attempting to do that. If not, you have done that. So do you have any comments or thoughts on that in the history of the North America? I mean, I guess we can bring up Meadowcroft Rock Shelter has older dates, and that's in the Western Pennsylvania area. And, you know, that's also debated due to the dead carbon effect because of coal, whether or not that's true or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been to that site personally. That's why I did my PhD at University of Pittsburgh in the geology department there. So I've been there. So there is some evidence, I guess, to say in the continental areas, interior areas of the Americas, North America, for early peopling. But another thing for the viewer to keep in mind is at 20 to 23,000 years, we are solidly in the last glacial maximum. I mean, we are talking ice sheets at their maximum extent in the last 100,000 years across North America. No ice-free corridor, not that we still think that's a thing, but that's totally frozen over. Ice probably in the North Sea, North Pacific is very far south latitude. It's a whole different world, essentially. All the ecosystems in North America shifted south. Otero Basin is wet. Today it's literally a desert. So when we put people at 20 to 23,000 years ago, and they're in the interiors, they somehow came across from Asia during or prior to the last glacial maximum, which is pretty extreme. Another extreme finding in a way.
For sure. Yeah, there's no doubt.
Whoa, check out Lake Erie at Bluff State Park. If you enjoyed this video, I'd like to ask you to please like it or subscribe to my channel to support science communication. Or you could also check out my book, Great Water in the Lost Mines of Lake Superior, on Amazon and Audible. Now back to Lake Erie.
For me, the most obvious answer is people probably got in before the ice, because it was coast to coast, ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, solid massive ice. Yeah, and that was probably, for me anyway, the single biggest eye opener about this was, holy cow, people were here almost certainly before the ice sheets closed off land access between Asia or Beringia and the rest of North America. Yeah, absolutely. That's the issue, isn't it? Yeah, the whole issue of the peopling of the Americas, this has been debated, forever.
Yeah,
Since
right.
people,
it's ongoing.
Europeans first arrived, the whole issue of, when did ancestors of Native Americans arrive? Yeah, and certainly the oldest, well-established, unequivocal occupation is Clovis, which is coast to coast.
Mm-hmm.
Distinctive lithic technology. And it's, to me, that's still one of the big mysteries, is where the heck did they come from? We don't even know that very well. But now, more and more sites are turning up. It depends on who you ask, because if you got 10 archaeologists in a room and gave them a list of all the possible sites and what's your top 10, you'd probably get 10 different answers, 10 different lists of who accepts what, because we all have our thinking, our biases and all that. Yeah, Cooper's Ferry's certainly one. There's a good dozen, I guess. Again, depends on who you ask. Meadowcroft is still debated for various reasons, but sure. And now we have this site. There are even some proposed older sites in Mexico and South America, but I think I've been teaching about this. I haven't never written a whole lot about the debate. I think, and I admit some bias here, but I think this is the best case we've got, the best, oldest case. Because I mean, you mentioned artifacts. There are no artifacts
Yeah.
except the footprints. And
Right.
as far as I'm concerned, you don't get much better than footprints. There's no
Yeah.
debate about broken rocks or broken bones. That's been a huge issue for a lot of these sites for decades. Is that broken? There's a broken rock. Was it broken by people or was it broken naturally? There's a broken bone. How did that break? That's not an issue when you have footprints, when you've got
Yeah.
tracks with a
Yeah.
human gait, 5 toes in a human gait. So, but yeah, other, where people were living, don't know. But one of the things, the other part of the story we worked out is we have a better feel now for the paleo landscape because we've got wetlands and lake deposits uh, well within a couple hundred meters of the tracks. And so you have this complex landscape with a stream flowing in to the edge of a lake and wetland system, a lake wetland system and a lake. So you have really quite a remarkable microenvironment that persisted for thousands of years before, during, and after the tracks were created. So, and we could come back to the
Hmm.
issue of why aren't there stone tools and all that. Let's see, where was I going with all that? Yeah, I mean it's quite remarkable. Now, one of the things I often bring up in classes when we used to discuss this whole thing was the original Folsom discovery almost 100 years ago near Folsom, New Mexico, which was the big game changer of its time. Fully unequivocal documentation of humans associated with ice age, so-called ice age animals, because that had been a huge debate too. Because in the old world, you had the Paleolithic people, and people interacting with extinct ice age mammals in Europe and other parts of the world. And the debate in the Americas was, were people here during the ice age, or did they come quite a bit later? Folsom took care of that. Now, the Folsom site was initially one obvious artifact and bones of a Pleistocene bison. We didn't know anything about Beringia. We didn't know anything about the ice-free corridor. We had no radiocarbon dating.
When was this discovery of
Late
Folsom?
20s, late
Okay,
20s,
late 20s, 1920s.
26, 27, 28, almost 100 years ago.
Okay.
And that resolved that debate. Were people in the Americas in the Pleistocene, or in the last ice age? And the answer was clearly yes, even though we didn't know anything about Beringia, we didn't know anything about ice-free corridors, we didn't have radiocarbon dating. It didn't matter. The data was there. It was the field data, the archaeological data. It's an archaeological question, and it's going to take archaeological data to answer it. So that's my approach here at White Sands. Yeah, it's a game changer, but it's obvious. I mean, I've seen the tracks. They're human tracks. I know the stratigraphy now pretty well, and we've got this quite a nice set of radiocarbon dates. And I don't
Yeah.
know where you go with that otherwise, because to have these 3 different sources of radiocarbon, all producing almost identical dates, I don't know how you can explain that except for some remarkable serendipity where you have 3 different sources of carbon all being wrong in the same way, in the same direction. They all
Right.
complement one another. So to do that, to have all this be some sort of mistake, some strange mixing, and it's giving you an apparent chronology, I don't know how that works. Nobody has even attempted to explain that.
Okay. I think let's get into the technicals then again
Okay.
of the dating and try to parse this out. And I'm gonna play devil's advocate and try to be a reviewer of your paper. And so the first thing I want to understand is, where is the OSL date in all this? Is it within the dating? From what I remember, the OSL dates from the same layer, but not next to the dates. All right, so do you know the context?
Well, not the specific context, but I mean, I know the stratigraphy, and I know for the seeds they were collecting. They obviously the seeds are in distinct lenses. You could see them. They form lenses, so that they're collecting seeds where there are seeds. The OSL, they're looking, and this comes back to what we were just talking about, this great huge pile of gypsum. You need quartz or feldspar
Yeah.
for OSL dating, so that's a bit of a needle in a haystack. So you get the OSL samples where you can. But the issue is, keep this in mind, there are multiple layers that produce seeds and multiple layers that produce tracks. There are 8 in the 2021 paper. There were 8 track horizons and multiple dated horizons. So where the OSL sample comes from in detail, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't matter if it's a meter over here or a meter over there or a few centimeters above or below. It sort of doesn't matter because the tracks and the dated horizons are relatively extensive. They run for some meters, and the rupia beds are in multiple levels. So you've got everything is nicely bracketed in time and in space. Picking out those grains, well, you don't pick out the grains. You collect what you can in the field and hope that you get some quartz or feldspar when you get back to the lab, because obviously you can't see this very easily in the field. And if you see it, you can't collect anything you see, because if you expose it to daylight, then you're done.
Right.
The OSL, as you know, works, it has to be a light, tight situation, and you
Yeah.
go in the lab and then you mess around with it under a red light. So
For
you
those that are
can't, yeah.
listening, if you want to look it up, we won't get into the details, but this is optically stimulated luminescence. It has to do with how long quartz and feldspars have been exposed to light or lack thereof light,
When was the
and
last time they were exposed to
exposed to
sunlight?
light,
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially. And it's an independent dating method outside of the carbon cycle, and you can use it ideally in places with a lot of quartz and feldspars, like dating glacial erratics. In this case, they isolated quartz or feldspar sand grains from stratigraphic layers in Otero at the same layers as the footprints, right? And their footprints solidly below that OSL
Oh, yeah.
date. Yeah.
Yep.
And the OSL date, I think, I don't remember what it was off the top. Maybe actually I have some notes. Maybe I wrote it down. It
They
ended up
were
being maybe not 23,000, but closer to,
they're at the
I don't know.
in part of the younger part of the sequence. I'm 21 sticks in my mind, but I'd have to look.
Yeah, I don't want to
And
say
that
it.
was
Then
a
I'll,
minimum age.
yeah.
That was a minimum age. Now, that's actually a fourth dating method. What I focused on in my discussions is comparing the 3 different carbon sources of carbon. And if you want to do it, you can add the OSL dating as yet a fourth
Fourth.
dating method, and they all fit reasonably well.
Right. I will say that OSL, there is only one date, though. It's not like a bunch of dates, correct? I believe it's pretty limited dating on the
I
OSL.
thought there was more than one. I should know that. I was thinking there was more than one OSL
Okay.
date, but in any case, it ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't write it down either, how many exactly. Okay, so that was one thing. So
Sure.
you have a fourth line of evidence. If you consider you have the rupia dates, the dates of the bulk organic material, and then
Pollen.
you have dates of
Pollen.
pollen.
Yeah.
And okay. And the pollen, I don't want to get into that because say, during the LGM, wouldn't there be a lot more pollen too? And that kind of would make sense because wouldn't the forest be bigger around the lake if it's wetter?
Yeah, but you can, there's other sources of pollen. Of course,
Even
ask
today.
anybody that's got asthma
Yeah,
that's hanging around in the desert today. Yeah.
there's plenty of pollen.
Yeah, there was certainly, yeah, you have loads of tree pollen. Of course, there's tree pollen today in that basin because it's right up in the mountains. It's 30 miles
Yeah.
away. And of
Okay.
course, some of that pollen goes for hundreds of miles. So, yeah, the issue is, or the argument is that it's old pollen falling in to where the tracks are. It's pollen that's older than the tracks. So it's giving you a misleading date. But the problem to me is, and we bring this up in our paper, is so that what they're arguing is the rupia is younger. The Rupia itself is younger than its radiocarbon age because it's taking up groundwater with old carbon. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
So
Following.
let's say you've got a Rupia seed that's 20,000 years old, and because of the old water or hard water effect, it's dating 23. And then they're arguing, okay, by sheer coincidence, you've got at 20,000 years ago, you've got pollen that's 23,000 years old that's falling in where the Rupia is that is falsely dating 20,000. Okay, so
Yeah, I
their
see.
argument is that you've got this Rupia of a given age that is younger than its radiocarbon age and younger than this pollen that's falling in.
Yeah, I follow. And then it
And
happens all
it
dates at
happens
23.
multiple, and it happens over and over. Now, yeah, and there hasn't been any published commentary on our dating. I'm sure it'll come out, but how do you explain the dating on the wetland deposits, which is another source of carbon? It's these plants that are growing in wetlands. One of the things I thought of, and we actually talk about it in the paper, is could the wetland material be derived from old Rupia? Rupia lives and dies and then it degrades. So we're actually dating Rupia stuff.
Remains, yeah, like just
Remains.
broken down organic matter
Exactly.
of the same aquatic plants or
Right.
macrophytes.
Yeah, we thought about that, and we actually there's a variety of lines of evidence. One is, again, depending on how deep into the woods you want to go, is looking at the carbon isotopes. And Rupia has a very different signal, carbon isotopic signal, than the wetland deposits. There's very little. We did a bunch of well, almost all of our radiocarbon dates, the Rupia and the wetland muds, we had stable carbon isotope data,
Yeah.
and almost all of them are quite a bit different.
It comes when you do the radiocarbon dates, you get the stable isotopic composition of
Usually,
C13, the
yeah,
delta
delta
C13.
C13, C12, right,
And
exactly.
that can tell you about
Tell
what
you about
kind of the
plants.
organic. Yeah.
Yeah, tell you it's actually a real interesting method because it could tell you about basic groups of plants, C3 and C4 and all that. We
Hmm.
don't have to dig into that, but
Hmm.
the isotopic signatures are almost all of them are quite a bit different between the Rupia and the wetland muds. There's a couple of samples that overlap, but for the most part, they're quite different. And even more so, we haven't seen any weathered Rupia. All the Rupia I've seen, and I've looked, I saw the Rupia beds where the tracks are, and then I collected my own samples in the other places. They're fresh. They're as fresh looking as they can be. They're not weathered. If there was degraded, weathered Rupia in those sediments, we would have seen it either in the field or in the lab, and it's just not there. Those Rupia seeds were in place, as far as I know, as they lived and died, and then they were buried in wetland deposits.
When you did the bulk sediment dates, you acidified the sediments, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, I know that's
Yeah. Oh
protocol,
yeah.
but just double checking for you. So you
Oh
got
yeah.
rid of all the dead when you acidify bulk organic or bulk sediment in a lake, you essentially remove the carbonates that are in there, and a lot of the so-called fossil carbon or dead carbon is removed. And then you rinse it to pH neutrality after that. And so what's remaining is just the organic material with all the dissolvable minerals that are soluble in hydrochloric acid, which I'm assuming you use like a 1 molar or one normal or something is what the labs usually
Right.
use. So that would take care of that. And then you probably did a base treatment and it removes a lot of the humic acid. So you did
Right.
the standard acid base acid,
ABA. Yep.
ABA, and then on the bulk material. Now that adds a little bit of confidence to those dates because, as I said, a lake person, bulk dates are always what you do when you have nothing else. And
Oh,
you
yeah.
probably were in that situation. You're probably well
Yeah.
aware of that
Yeah. I've been doing it
because
for years. I worked on the Great Plains for a lot of my career. There's not a chunk of wood as far as the eye can see for charcoal. So
yeah,
I've had a lot of experience with dating bulk sediment. Yeah, there's pretreatment. It's not perfect, But when you get 24 dates that stack up with very little problems in the sequence, there's always little odd looking things here and there, but the whole sequence as a package is, in my experience, is quite remarkable. Going back to what you were saying, the other thing too about this is that these wetlands were very shallow, which again, when you have really shallow water, the carbon in the water will mix with the atmosphere. And particularly that's important with respect to the fresh water that's coming in from into the stream beds where the tracks are. Is that was another argument that this issue, just it's not an issue, the old water problem, because you have fresh water coming in to the stream, and that's where the plants are growing, is in the fresh water. They don't, there's no reason why, in fact, there's no evidence that they would be growing or living off of groundwater. There's no evidence one way or the other where groundwater was at any one particular time, but we know that fresh water had to be carrying those stream sediments in.
Okay.
And it
Now,
was shallow. The whole
yeah,
system was very shallow.
that's going to tend towards a lower, if there is a hard water effect, having a lower water volume is going to, I think it's going to minimize that, like you're saying, and it's going to be more in equilibrium with the atmosphere, especially if it's a big surface area and shallow water, which Otero was. So that does make sense. Has anyone tried to date charcoal or any bits or look for charcoal in the sediments at Otero?
Well, we're always looking, but I've never seen.
Never seen any?
Believe me,
Yeah, I bet you looked.
I have. Well, and on a couple of occasions, I remember seeing seeds and thinking it was charcoal, but realized quickly that it wasn't. There is nothing. In fact, I was having this discussion with somebody the other day, and I made the comment that I've never seen anything bigger than a sand grain on the east side of the basin. And I just realized that there is something bigger than sand grains out there. It's the rapia seeds. But
The only
otherwise, you
other
won't
thing.
see anything out there. Because if you look at a map, we don't know where the edge of the Paleo Lake was because it's under the dunes. Nobody's
Mm,
ever mapped it out. But
yeah,
where we're working is, it's not on the edge, it's not in the middle, but it's not on the edge. You're way out in the lake, and we're quite a ways, minimum of 15 kilometers from the basin margins, like where the alluvial fans are coming in.
yeah.
Minimum of 15 kilometers and to the west, and where the water's coming in, the edge of the basin is 15 meters or kilometers to the west. So you're way out in the middle. There's really no way to get anything bigger than a sand grain out there. Not a single rock. That comes back to the issue of artifacts.
Mm,
We've been all over that place, and you literally don't see anything bigger than a sand grain out there. And charcoal would be real obvious. We would have seen it. The
yeah.
people where the tracks are, it would have been very obvious because it would be so unusual.
Are you looking for charcoal on like the size of like about 100 micrometer size?
We did not do that. No, that would be a good experiment.
Because that's what I'm an expert at.
Well, we should
I'm
send you.
finding micro charcoal in fine grained carbonate lakes is my
Okay.
specialty. And you use peroxide to disaggregate, and you use like a really nice paintbrush, fine tip paintbrush, and you can collect charcoal. And the charcoal is airborne. You can eliminate that. It had to burn and grow above ground. I mean, I guess some people do argue you could burn macrophytes in the littoral zone during a low stand, but that will blow up into the air and come down. And then the best part about charcoal is it produces a lot of carbon during the radiocarbon dating. Do you know like the amount of carbon proportion to the material?
Right.
Charcoal is extremely high, so you just need very small specks to get really nice dates.
How big a sample do you work with?
You can take one, you can take 1 cc and then put them in vials. I have like a cc piston sampler or 2 cc piston sampler right out of the stratigraphy right into a glass vial. Then you treat it in peroxide, dilute peroxide, which bleaches all the organic matter except for silicates, minerals, and charcoal. And
Oh,
probably rupia will hold a little bit of color, but overall the peroxide makes organic matter light brown. All
yeah,
the
yeah.
And so the charcoal then will just come right out. And I wouldn't be surprised if that lake, it's in New Mexico during the LGM, there's a forest around it. There had to have been forest fires. And that would have at least brought like aerosol
Airborne, right?
charcoal. You won't find any clear identified maybe pieces bigger than a centimeter, whatever. But I think maybe that's an option to try one day. And
Well, we just next time we go out there, we might grab a sample or two for you.
we should talk.
Yeah,
I would be interested
we'll
in doing it.
communicate about this because I know exactly the place to get it without having to dig a trench.
Awesome. That'd be very, very cool. I would love to work on this too. It'd be awesome. All right. Now the other thing I was gonna get at is, now you're saying stratigraphically they're solidly in the LGM. Just from my experience in coring lakes, you can tell like an LGM sequence versus the Holocene because it's a huge difference. Sometimes, like when you're up in the northern part of the mainland states, you see the
Yeah,
deglacial sequence, and then you'll see the formation of like organic, rich, fine grains. So you could kind of tell if you found like footprints in that glacial material. Let's say there's no, that had to have been at the deglacial boundary. There's just no
at
way.
a minimum, yeah.
At a minimum, there's no, yeah. So at Otero, are those LGM sediments distinct to the, I guess, early Holocene or maybe earlier
Well,
Pleistocene?
don't forget the early Holocene is the world's biggest pile of gypsum sand.
So that's when that happens, is the early Holocene, it all gets deflated.
The dating is not clear, in part because the lake record, so much of it's gone. There hasn't been, other people have worked on the lake story in other parts of the basin. I just finally realized this the other day when I was compiling everybody else's dates, that there are almost no good LGM dates from anywhere else. Most of the dates are older, and some are LGM. And I think that's because most people worked on the west side, and you're near the mountain front, and it was probably the depot center, the lowest part of the basin, and that's where the most deflation probably has been. But for whatever reason, because there's nothing like the stratigraphic sequence we saw in our cores and in our trenches, and you can still see there's nothing like it on the west side of the basin where all the other work had been in the past. It's a very different story. It looks different, slightly different age, and you have this real nice LGM record. We have a total of about 24 dates, and not all of them, but most of them are from this stacked sequence of wetland muds interfering lake deposits. And there's nothing like that anybody else has reported from the basin, just because nobody had done much work on the east side. So this is all new. And the youngest date we have is the youngest lake beds we have and wetlands are about 17,000. So there's a gap there that it's probably buried under the dunes.
Okay.
Somewhere to the east, because you've got this sloping escarpment, and we're up here, but it continues east. But you've got, again, the world's biggest pile of gypsum sand on top of it. Anyway, that's a whole other logistical issue, which I'd like to see done. Again, you'd have to have drilling equipment that could get out into the sand dunes, and the park certainly doesn't want bulldozers pushing sand dunes around. I wouldn't want to anyway, because it's quite beautiful out there. But yeah, there's a lot more work to be done, completely separate from human prints and all that, of the lake story out there, the terminal post-LGM late Pleistocene.
Yeah.
The end of Lake Otero. We
Yeah. The
don't
end of Lake
have a very
Otero.
good story for the end of Lake Otero.
I mean, I'm interested in also really how it formed. It clearly seems kind of like a tectonic driven type system of the basin.
Yeah.
It's maybe extensionary or something
Well,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah. There are over 100 paleo lake basins in the Great Basin, and then in New Mexico is part of that same system, and there's another half dozen Paleo Lake basins. The classic like Bonneville, and yeah, it's all that extensional structure that we're in the Rio Grande Rift,
Okay.
which is a little different from the main basin and range extension, but it's all related. So yeah, it's just one of those, yet another one of those basins, that closed basins that has a Paleo Lake. Now there's another one at the north end of the Missile Range in the Jornada del Muerto Basin. You just drive north, go through a pass, and you're in the Jornada del Muerto Basin. Lake Trinity, it's right near the Trinity bomb site.
Okay.
And it's there because there was a big basalt flow that dammed off the drainage. So that's a real different lake that there's almost
Whoa.
nothing published on. That's what I'm working on right now, is
Nice.
trying to get that written up. But yeah, it's a whole different story up there. So it's a lot of fun to compare these
Yeah, that would be
lake
interesting.
stories.
And no one's gone out there to do like a deep core, like a vibra core type situation in either one of these basins yet?
No, well, no. That's wrong. There were some cores in the 70s, and the USGS got one, and it's been some years out under the dune, the main dune system in the park. And one of those cores is preserved. There's been a little bit of dating on it. It's been other people have been doing this, but for a variety of reasons, it hasn't been easily accessible, and the people that have looked at it haven't seen a lot of material to date. But that's all I know. And that was with heavy duty. It wasn't vibracores, it's just, heavy duty big coring rigs that they could get out into some of the blowouts. There's a paved road in the park that you can take to do a little, it's called Dunes Drive Road. And they got a couple of big cores right off the road in blowouts. But that was years ago. But the one core it still exists somewhere. Well, I think it's in Denver. And I know some people that have tried to look at it, and it's been a problem for some reason. And apparently it doesn't have a lot to date. But yeah,
Yeah, that could be.
it's
And
there to be.
if cores aren't preserved well, even the
Right.
well preserved ones don't last decades. I mean, they'll start to shrink and crack, and the stratigraphy gets screwed up, and they break apart, and you can't figure out how they go together. You lose 10 centimeters of dust, and
Right.
it's better to be fresh. But I think that would be a way to really like line up the sediments up to the LGM. Then you could be like, okay, then here's the early Holocene unconformity or erosional vent blowing, deflating, and then you could really be like, oh, and the footprints are solidly. I mean, if even in the context of below,
Yeah.
with assuming dates, and that may not be possible, but
Now we
maybe just
have
one way to support.
some evidence of initial phase of erosion of that basin in excess of 12,000. We have a
Okay.
archaeological site. There's just south of the main dune system, there's some old parabolic dunes. And as it turns out, it's one of the first places I looked at when I was working out there. This is on the Missile Range, south of the main dune system. There's a Paleo-Indian site. It's got Folsom and slightly younger archaeology draped over an old weathered arm of a parabolic dune. So that parabolic dune has to be older than the Folsom occupation, which was Folsom. The youngest date for Folsom is 12,000. So that dune, gypsum dune, I should add, is telling us that there was some initial phase of deflation as far back as greater than 12,000 years.
Okay, I see what you're
So
saying.
things are drying out. If I think of it, I'll send you, we have a paper on that
Mm-hmm.
where I talk about the initial onset of the white sands
The drying out, and
genesis.
for the people that are watching this, the drying out of Otero, it's not like a localized thing necessarily. It's this process that it's a overall climate change
Oh, yeah.
process from the glaciers start to really retreat, about 18,000 years ago. They expand a little bit during the younger dry. So there's a little bit of waxing and waning, but they're overall shrinking going northward and starting 18,000 years ago. And then you can imagine all south of the ice sheets. These ice sheets are kilometers thick. The climate is changing. Ecosystems are moving north. That the wet conditions of the Southwest and the monsoonal system breaks down, and all of a sudden the Southwest goes from being the green Southwest North America goes to a dry Southwest North America. And these big rift lakes like Lake Bonneville, and there's bunches of them, they dry out.
All dry out. Yeah. Now, Bonneville
And
drained catastrophically. That's a whole separate
yeah, oh,
story.
sorry.
But
Because
it
I know some
eventually
did.
dried out. It
Yeah,
eventually dried out. And Great Salt Lake is the remnant.
same one. Great Salt Lake is one of the
Is
remnants of
the
the big.
last remnant of Bonneville. But yeah, that's the story for the Southwest. Now, just as a footnote, having nothing to do with anything else, the monsoon started after everything dried out. It's an early
Really?
Holocene. Just the monsoon only in the defining sense of the source of moisture, not
Mm,
torrential rain. It's a monsoonal system, which is when you get the ground heats up in the summer such that it pulls in moisture off the ocean, and then in the winter the ground is colder than the ocean, and so everything goes offshore. That cycle began. That's been a big deal here at the University of Arizona. A lot of people have studied it in the onset of monsoon system when it happened. But it's a post-glacial, it's a Holocene thing basically.
oh, really?
But
Okay.
again, it's just, it has to do with differential heating of the land, bringing in moisture, pushing out moisture. We think, people think, a monsoon in India and 15, 20 inches of rain, da 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 da. But and that's, they have a monsoonal system. So do we. We just don't get as much rain out of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, lately we haven't gotten any out of it. So.
Been a little dry,
Oh man, yeah, it's pretty bad.
but not down in Texas apparently.
Well, that's the game, isn't it? If it's dry somewhere, it's going to get wet somewhere else. So yeah, it's awful, terrible.
You brought up the archaic site that has recently been found, and then you say there's a Folsom site with it's overlying a dune. Maybe when I talk to the other people like Dave Rochelle, he's written some of the counter papers. His argument was there wasn't anything. From what I remember, he said there's nothing found in the basin, this absence of evidence. But you're saying there's a new archaic site. Maybe can you talk about that a little more, or why do you think it's archaic?
It's archaic age. It's 8,800 years old. So that's just after the Paleo-Indian, Folsom, Clovis, all that. That's a little older. They're rare. Early archaic is really rare. One of my colleagues here thinks we've got a structure. It's some kind of house floor, stratified, and then it's surrounded by hearths. This floor is just loaded with plant remains and charcoal and burning. And one of the reasons it preserved, think about what happens if you build a fire on top of a pile of gypsum, you're going to end up with plaster of Paris. And so this thing is preserved as a remnant. It was buried in the real early phase of the White Sands Dune. It's the oldest, it's given us the oldest date directly on the main White Sands Dune system, 8,800 years. And some of that sand moved on and exposed this site. And that's why we were looking at it. It's so unusual. And it has an archaic stone tool uh, uh, assemblage with it. Not as high quality raw material as you see in the Paleo-Indian sites. Some bifaces and some points that they're not as, for lack of a better term, they're not as gee whiz as a Folsom or as a Clovis or something like that. So it's very clearly, in fact, we're finishing up a paper like this week on that site. But I did a paper on the onset of White Sands. That's part of the story. That site, this archaic site, is part of that story because we've got the 8,800-year date there, and it's clearly being exposed on the edge of the Dunes field. And then separate from that, off to the south, we have this Folsom site draped over an arm of a gypsum parabolic. So those are the two oldest components of the dune system that anybody had ever documented. But before that, yeah, there's Folsom is everywhere out there. Folsom is all over the place. I went 5 summers of field work, and every time I went out for 5 summers in a row, I found a Folsom point. That's never happened in my life and never will
Wow.
again. Folsom is everywhere out there. It's really common. And Clovis, which is the oldest, for whatever reason, it's exceedingly rare in the Tularosa Basin. I have never seen an honest to God Clovis point in the Tularosa Basin, but there's a bunch of Clovis just to the north in the Jornada do Muerto Basin I mentioned, where the Trinity site is. In any case, Clovis is around. So that's the oldest well-documented archaeology. And that's the way it is across North America in general. Clovis is the earliest clearly recognizable widespread archaeological record. Now, in terms of the tracks, people have asked this question many times, is, okay, you've got these human tracks. Why isn't there any archaeology? So here's a little game to play. Then the 2021 paper, they document 64 footprints. Some of them are part of a track, and others are just one or two isolated tracks, because they had a narrow trench. And so that's, if you have a trench going this way and the tracks are going that way, you're going to see, if you're lucky, one or two tracks, right? So they didn't expose a big area. People don't realize that. So 64 footprints. How long does it take to make a footprint? A
A
second
second.
at best?
Yeah.
64 footprints. That's 64 seconds of time in a stratigraphic sequence. So no one track. I think there's one that's 30 tracks, 30 footprints in a track. So that's 30 seconds. What are the odds that some hunter-gatherer is going to drop a tool in the space of a few seconds? No, I'm serious. I'm serious about this, because people keep raising this, and I keep thinking, why are you? Think about it, folks, especially a tool that could literally be a matter of life or death. And you're going to drop it and you don't know it, and your kid or your wife or your brother or your buddy doesn't say, oh, you dropped a tool.
Yeah.
And the other part of that is bone and wood would not preserve. As I said, I've never seen anything larger than a sand grain out there. We have tracks of extinct fauna all over the place, mammoth, direwolf, all sorts of things. It's an astonishing record out there of megafauna tracks. There is not a single bone I've ever seen coming out of the deposits. So it just doesn't preserve, or wood. So that's part of the story. And then again, stone tools, you have to go minimum of 10 kilometers to find any kind of raw material, any stone. So again, I just, when you're walking back and forth to your car, how much do you drop?
Yeah.
It's just, it's a good question, but it's one of those good questions that all you have to do is think about it for a couple of seconds, and it's a non-issue.
Yeah. And I think maybe people are saying, like, in the Tularosa Basin in general, maybe not necessarily at the trackway, or people saying at the trackway they should have lost something.
Oh yeah. Oh no,
Really?
that's come up. In fact, just the other day with a paleontologist I know brought that up. Well, how come there are no artifacts out there?
Yeah. I guess, in the absence of evidence isn't evidence of anything.
Exactly.
So that's just speculation. And that's another thing I've had on this channel, talking about with people. And I increasingly see this with scientists, but I see it definitely with day-to-day people. They don't know the difference between speculation and evidence.
Yeah.
When you speculate, you can't I heard somebody say, when all the speculation adds up, it's evidence for something. And I was like, no, you got a bunch of speculation. You could speculate about that. This could be this, maybe that, is this. But evidence is like a radiocarbon date. Evidence is a footprint. Evidence is a fulsum point. Evidence is stratigraphy. And there's a degree of opinion in some bit of evidence, but it should be minimal, and it's objective measurement in some way.
Yeah, that's why I think the way I think. I've seen the footprints, and I've collected the radiocarbon samples, and know the rest of the radiocarbons. My interpretations and my co-authors, it's what we've seen in the field and generated in the lab.
Okay. Yeah.
It's completely independent of what the ice-free corridor was doing or what Beringia was doing. It's essentially immaterial. Like I said, with the Folsom site, the original Folsom discovery, nobody knew anything about that, about Beringia or anything. The data was very clear in the field. Artifact, Pleistocene fauna.
Right in there.
Case closed.
Now the footprints, you said you've found, and your colleagues and have found lots of different types of animals. And can you maybe
Yeah.
talk about what kind of footprints you found briefly?
Yeah, the park people, David Bustos, has been driving all of this. He's a biologist, and he runs the head of the environmental division at White Sands. He was first time I was ever out there. He was showing us again by coincidence right where the near where the human tracks are found. Mammoth tracks, giant ground sloth, dire wolf, camel. There's another one.
Sloth? Did you mention
Yeah, I'm
sloth?
sorry. Yeah, giant ground sloth, mammoth, dire wolf, camel. I saw some bear tracks in one of the excavations, but I don't know what kind of bear. It's astonishing. It is really amazing. I've seen these tracks all over the place out there, and that alone is a remarkable story in
Yeah.
the park and on the Missile Range because they're all over the place. And so these animals, not surprisingly, they're tromping around on the lake bed because it was a resource for them as well as people.
Now, the question to me then is, if there's footprints with mammoths, with ground sloth, I mean, they're next to each other. And you did mention earlier some people misidentified sloth footprints
Mhm.
for human footprints.
Right.
But either way, let's say sloth, there's some sloth, there's some human, but they're next to each other and it's hard to tell apart. When did sloth go extinct? When did mammoth go extinct? Because wouldn't those also provide kind of what do we call that, fossil dating? It's, if we find the same fossil, mastodon, or sorry, a mammoth footprint with a human footprint, when did they go extinct in New Mexico, mammoth?
Well, mammoth about 13,000, like in a lot of places. Yeah.
So they go down to the Younger Dryas. Because my feeling was, the La Brea tar pits, they show that a lot of the megafauna go extinct before the Younger Dryas,
Yes, absolutely.
right?
Yes. Well, that they're in decline
They're in decline.
because there's been this debate forever about
Yes,
Clovis and mammoth.
right.
And
So I
there's
got into this.
clearly Clovis mammoth kills. That's not an issue, but the argument is, did Clovis people wipe out the mammoth and some of the other animals? And there is a time coincidence there. But and one of the things about that La Brea data and some other data that's been turning up over the last couple of decades that's beginning to suggest, and I think La Brea is one of the best cases because they have so much data, that a lot of these animals are already on their way out
Right.
by the time people arrived. And you could debate, and we'll probably never know, that maybe the hunting pressure was just that extra little stress, or not, that they were on their way out and they became extinct on their own. And that's a whole other debate. Personally, I don't think the hunting case it still hasn't been made because there's
Yeah.
13, 14 mammoth kills North America. That's not very much. And most of those other animals, there's no hunting evidence. There's no ground sloth kill. There's maybe one camel kill and one horse kill, but you have to account for all these other megafauna.
Yeah.
But yeah, the tracks they're really amazing to see. They're just all over the place. Yeah.
That would be really cool to see. And it is, when I started talking to people about that, I think under your um, suggestion, I emailed the guy at the mammoth site that you know of. I believe now his name, this is embarrassing. His name has
Which
lost me.
which
In North Dakota or South
Jim
Dakota.
Mead? Jim Mead?
No, his student,
Maybe I don't know that student.
Chris Jass. Chris
Okay.
Jass was his student like a long time ago, who's now in Alberta. And Chris was
Oh,
on I had him on here after you told me to talk to Jim Mead. Jim Mead's like, you should talk to Chris
okay.
Jass.
Okay.
And then I started to realize that this extinction of the megafauna is really not that clear cut, and it's very regional. But to me, if you find footprints with mammoths, I mean, my feeling is they probably were, it has to, I guess, yeah, I would still put it around 16,000, maybe 15,000 years ago, which would not help the case. But I don't know. I think that's corroborating evidence, but I guess not corroborating evidence for necessarily 21 to 23,000 years old, but definitely corroborating evidence you're solidly in the Pleistocene before the megafauna went extinct. And in New Mexico, they could have been extinct by 18,000 years ago for all we know. Or I should say extirpated, unless there's evidence there, to the contrary. I mean, we
Well,
just don't know.
The Clovis site, it's got mammoth and Clovis in
Okay.
eastern New Mexico on the plains, on the high plains.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and
So
here in
there's
the San
that.
Pedro, southeastern Arizona, there are 4 Clovis mammoth kills. So
Oh, okay.
they're around. Yeah, actually, but these lake beds, if we could find the whole suite, although we don't know for sure whether the lake persisted until Younger Dryas time or not. But the mammoth tracks, there are mammoth tracks in the same levels as the human tracks at White Sands.
Mhm.
If you go back to the 2021 paper, in one of their trench sections, they identify a couple of footprints that they exposed when they dug the trench that's got the human tracks. So all these animals are out there at the same time as the humans
Mhm.
in the LGM. Now that's the whole issue again, is what's
Yeah.
going on later. And yeah, I wish we knew when the last gasp of Lake Otero was, but somebody will figure it out.
Yeah, that actually then would be the next thing, is to be like, when did the lake actually deflate? And then that gives you at least that upper constraint.
Well, that's that. A lot of people, for a long time, it was thought it was about 7,000 was when the Dune system cranked up for a variety of reasons. But that this archaic site I was telling you about, 8,800, that's now the oldest dated component of the main dune system, is the
Okay.
8,800. The old remnant parabolic, it's south of the main dune system. So all we know is down there to the south, there was some significant deflation happening greater than 12,000, but we don't know anything else because, again, a lot of the story is gone
Yeah.
and it's buried under the world's biggest pile of
Yeah.
gypsum. There could easily be older gypsum sand under the current system. We just don't have access to it. Easy access.
Makes sense. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but genetically, what kind of implications would this have for humankind in the Americas? I think from what I can tell, I'm not an expert in DNA, but
No, 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 no.
isn't there some sort of conspicuous lack of like early Pleistocene DNA? It seems to all kind of trace back, even the DNA mitochondrial way of determining when populations split and stuff like this. It seems like that's all pointing towards like 16 or so years ago, 1,000 years ago. And I wish I would have researched this before I brought this up, because I really don't want to be misspeaking. But my feeling, maybe you remember this too. You don't know?
No, but you're something in the upper teens, as I recall, was a bottleneck
Something
somewhere.
like that. Yeah.
But the dating, the mitochondrial, the DNA dating is pretty arm wavy.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, ultimately, and I colleagues who know a lot more about this than I do, archaeologists, will admit that ultimately it's the archaeology on the ground that's going to sort this out, where people were when they were. And of course, that's such a spotty record. Yeah, I think there's been some discussion that maybe there was a genetic bottleneck in Beringia, but again, that would postdate what's
Yeah.
going on in white.
Right. And there's possibility, I guess, that the people of White Sands maybe died out these early Pleistocene,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or sorry, yeah, these earlier populations may not have necessarily left a genetic imprint in the later waves.
Exactly. I had this discussion with somebody the other day, but that's my feeling, my view of the data. You've got these data points: Cooper's Ferry, White Sands, Meadowcroft. They're little dots, and there's no continuity. Before Clovis, nobody has demonstrated any kind of cultural continuity. you've got these dots, these data points here and there around the country. There's no site where you have long, many generations of people. White Sands is unusual in that context. And there's no artifact, material culture, continuity in space or time. Just all of a sudden, and you have no Clovis predecessors, artifact predecessors. Now, I probably don't know it well enough and maybe overstating, but it seems like Clovis just appears coast to coast. Obviously, that's not how it worked. But in terms of what we see in the archaeological record. So my view, the way I look at it is, for the most part, people got in, hung out for a little while, and then just didn't make it until very late. I mean, that is my simple view to
Yeah.
explain what we see.
Okay.
Because otherwise, where are the sites? Why aren't we?
Yeah.
They had to live in this. They all needed shelter and water and food like everybody else. So they shouldn't be, they should be along rivers or in caves or around lakes.
Yeah.
And the story just isn't there, not yet. And gosh, think of all the earth moving that's been done, particularly just since legally mandated archaeological work 50
Mhm.
years ago.
Yeah.
All the, why aren't these sites turning up? More of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably an oversimplification of the situation, but it would seem like we would know a lot more than we do if there were a continuous population. You'd think that they would also, if it was continuous, it'd just be more and more and more through time. And you don't see
Yeah.
that.
Hmm. Now, an interesting rabbit hole I went down recently that is sort of related maybe to what we're talking about. It is related, I should say. Is this peopling of Americas, even the solid dates of 16,000 years ago, even if it goes to 20, 23,000 years ago, why are Homo sapiens taking so long to get to North and South America when we know they boated to Australia?
Oh, right.
Modern Homo sapiens voted to Australia 50 to
Yeah.
60,000 years ago. You know, across Indonesia, some of the islands were certainly islands even during the LGM when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, people. You have to know that. During the LGM, imagine the coastline, totally different. Imagine the ocean going down 120 meters globally. And so, and then there's some little bit of evidence. I haven't been able to get somebody on the podcast that even Neanderthals made boats or rafts and got to islands in the Mediterranean prior to modern Homo sapiens coming to Europe. To me, that suggests there should be older dates in North America, because why is 60,000 years ago in Australia? I guess you can maybe make the argument the ice is blocking them, or just they just didn't have the technology, which is one argument Lauren Davis at OSU makes. I mean, maybe I'm really going to put this in a nutshell, but he finds that this Hook and his colleagues, Hook shows up in Japan in the end of the during the LGM, along with the advent of the stone projectile point, the predecessor of Clovis, or the idea of this biface. That's an LGM invention from Asia. Do you know this? Have you heard of this idea?
A particular artifact style? Because biface
The
technology has been around a long time.
I guess it originated in that area. So like before that, there's hand axes, right? And then there's shards of chert and obsidian that are used. But the idea of having the symmetrical biface, so like it's symmetrical on both sides. The very first evidence for that is Siberia in northeastern Asia in the late Pleistocene, like 20 to 25,000 years ago. That's where it first shows up, according to Lauren Davis. And I will fact check this and put a little thing up if I'm wrong about that.
Right. I guess I'd have to see exactly how they're defining that, because I was thinking biface technology has been around a lot longer. But that
Okay.
that could be a different issue than a particular stylistic
It's different than Clovis. It's different than Folsom. It's the
Right. But different also from just a biface just means it's worked on both sides,
right,
which is
exactly.
completely different than a very distinctive style of tool making where you actually it really is like almost a mirror image on both sides. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that story,
Okay.
but that's okay.
But there's something I kept asking him again, and I'm like, so you're saying the biface? And he's like, yeah, like the very first evidence for a somewhat of a biface, like the predecessor of Folsom Clovis,
Clovis,
appears to show up in that part of Asia, yeah, Northeast Asia, Siberia, at the LGM. And then I don't think he claims this, but what I gathered from the discussion is that technology coupled with this fish hook they find in the Baja Peninsula. They made these mussel shell hooks that are
oh,
almost the same as they look the same as in the islands off of Japan. You
right.
find them in the islands off of Baja Peninsula. These as well were first evidence for these show up around 20,000 years ago in Northeast Asia. So we
Asia.
have the biface showing up, the hooks, and then all of a sudden soon thereafter, or right around there, according to your dates, their people are showing up into the Americas. So that to me means that it wasn't a boating technology issue. It was like literally a hunting megafauna and big fish issue. You needed maybe that type of point was just perfect for hand throwing spears at mastodons and having hand axes and shards of crappy things just don't fly right.
Right. Of course, we don't
Throwing it
have
all
those.
together.
We don't have those sites.
Mhm. Yeah. So anyway, I was like thinking it is just weird that if humans made it to Australia 50 to 60,000 years ago, people were on boats. People were
Yeah,
boating.
had to be.
Had
Well,
to be
that
boating.
it's that argument has been made for some of the early sites in South America, but nobody.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then you have the issue of there were boats 60,000 years ago, but they didn't make it to where I'm living. I mean, till 1,000 years ago.
exactly. Yeah, and that's a long way across the Southern Pacific to South America. A long.
Right. A long way. And
Yeah,
it is
Hawaii is a good example. That's because we're in the middle of.
we're way out. And even the one that really blows my mind, and I think it's found later or around the same time as Hawaii, is New Zealand. New Zealand is really close to the coast of Australia, with people boating for 60,000 years, and Polynesians don't show up till about 1000 AD.
I didn't know that. That is remarkable, isn't it?
Isn't that the most
Yeah,
remarkable? It's like
I've never,
right there.
I didn't know that story. That's really
And all
interesting.
the flightless birds, this is a clear cut example of humans show up and the megafauna go extinct. I mean, as
Oh
clear
yeah,
as you
that's
can.
yeah.
The flightless birds just go gone, and fires rage across the island. I'm kind of working on a similar project here with looking at fire reconstruction across the Hawaiian Islands with the settlement of Polynesians.
Nice.
But this it's inspired by the study by David McQuenty at in New Zealand, where they find right around 1000 AD on the paleo records across the South Island there are fires everywhere around, and they correspond right with the dates of Polynesians showing up, and the fire regimes change, megafauna go extinct, and this is all 1,000 years ago. But yeah, very weird that they didn't make it there, and then that kind of throws a monkey wrench into my idea. If they're boating for 60,000 years, why didn't they get to America? Well, why didn't they make it to New Zealand? So that
Exactly. Right.
kind of screws up the whole thing. But I tried to find there's a book coming out on early boating technology in like Indonesia and I have the emails of the two authors and they haven't gotten back to me, but I want to get them on because I want to talk to them about that too.
Yeah.
Is this idea of their boats are around and even maybe Homo Neanderthals use them, and it's like humans don't show up until
Yeah,
16,000.
that's nuts that Neanderthals are making those. That's cool.
And there's some idea it could just be rafts of wood bound together. It doesn't necessarily have to be a very advanced boat, but still the fact that they're trying to push out and look into new lands and use technology essentially to get out to a new place means they're pushing the boundaries. And Neanderthals are around hundreds of thousands of years. So I don't see why, in my mind, it's not impossible. And that a Neanderthal could have rafted up to freaking Alaska. Why not? They were up in Siberia. And why didn't they make it to some coastal islands off of the Aleutians or
Well, of
something like
course,
that?
there could always be the odd person that did that will never.
Yeah,
And
we'll never.
as going back to what you're saying about sea level, there could be, Lord
Yeah,
knows what
that's a
the story
huge issue.
is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
The sea level thing is a gigantic elephant in the room because all the evidence for the early stuff is underwater. I mean, I guarantee like
so much of it. Yeah,
99%, yeah, of the at least them coming across the Americas. But yeah, man, Vance, this was a great conversation.
yeah,
I was so excited to have you on again to talk
yeah.
about
It's fun.
the white sands footprints. You have the new date for people that maybe just watch the end of this. Vance and his colleagues have a new paper in Science Advances. It came out June 2025, and it's support for the early dating of the human footprints in New Mexico. And their chronology supports this LGM presence or last glacial maximum presence for humans in that part of the world in White Sands, New Mexico. It's extraordinary claim, I think, as you would admit. And and the result has been a lot of extraordinary evidence you're putting forth to try to support the claim. Many papers, starting with Bennett in 2021, Pagodi, and there's been back and forth with other people debating the age of the dates and whether or not contamination with hard water or dead carbon is causing these dates to be older. But you're saying stratigraphy wise, OSL dating, different types of carbon reservoirs were dated, pollen, bulk organic matter that was treated with acid-base acid, and the rupia seeds all point towards 20 to 23,000 years ago. And um, it's an amazing claim. I guess I still would say I'm on the fence because, wow, that is just so old. And I got to talk to the first author, and I was thinking when you were talking earlier, I had you on to be the skeptic for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, where you had to be the guy that's saying, I know, what's this microscopic evidence for this massive thing? So you had to play the skeptical conservative scientist, and now you come on to the second time, and now you're the one putting out like probably more of an extraordinary claim, in my opinion, than the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and you're holding steady.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying. Data,
Yeah,
solid data.
solid
That's the
data.
difference.
So you're willing to
That's a good
go with
point.
the solid data, no matter even if it puts you out on a limb.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's the point of being a scientist?
That's the fun part.
Oh, yeah. 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 I have no problem with that because, yeah, the data, if somebody comes up with some, good contradictory evidence, fine, but we got to see it.
I
That's the
agree.
same thing for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Solid data, reproducible data.
And that's
Yeah.
what you need.
Yep.
We need evidence, not speculation.
Yeah, exactly. To go back to your earlier comments. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Yeah, I don't have plans for much more field work out there, but I'll be interested to see what other people do.
Me too.
But you and I can communicate. I know exactly the place to get some samples for you.
Okay. I'd love to count some charcoal for you and see if I can find some in there. I wouldn't be surprised. People tell me there's no charcoal in sediments, and then I look under the microscope and I can pick it right out, and you'll be surprised where you'll find it. And you don't need much for a solid date, and it would be very hard to argue hard water effect from burned charcoal,
Yeah, airborne charcoal. Yeah,
airborne
for sure.
charcoal. I mean, and in my opinion, it's the best way to date sediments with a lot of dead carbon, hard water, or
Oh, right.
inorganic
Yeah,
carbon in the sediments. Our experience with my lab group and with my advisor is when we saw carbonates in the lake sediment mud, we look for charcoal or discrete, identifiable terrestrial
plant
macrophytes like
matter.
pine needles that we could certainly say it's not a macrophyte. Because then once you start doing macrophytes, you got to go in to figure out, oh, we tested
Right.
it, we did this and that. Where if you just eliminate, if you can, doing macrophytes, then you don't have to talk about that hard water effect, if possible. So I'm very excited to count some samples for you. And
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
be nice.
I was just talking to some people that going out, just take care of some odds and ends this fall. So yeah, I'll talk to you some more about that, but yeah, it'd be pretty easy to
Cool.
collect what you need.
Now, do you have any papers coming out you want to talk about, or anything we should be looking out for with white sands in the next year?
It'll be a little while. What I'm actually working on right now, as I said, I've been working out there in the Tularosa Basin and then the next basin north since 2012, 2013. And I've got piles and piles of data I'm synthesizing. There's a book, by the way, that's going to come out later this year, University of Utah Press, on Paleo-Indian archaeology of the Southwest. And I have a chapter in there on the Paleo-Indian archaeology, Folsom and all that, of the Tularosa Basin. There's also going to be, excuse me, a chapter on the footprints in the park that Dave Bustos is the lead author, the guy that in the part that's driving this. He'll have a chapter talking more about tracks. What are we looking for? What do we find? How do you preserve a track? that should be of interest to a lot of people because I've said this before. Another thing, most archaeologists will never see a footprint in their sites ever. And unless people are living on rocks, and in places they do, they left footprints. I have seen, the only other footprints I've ever seen was archaeological site on the coast of Argentina that had loads and loads of tracks, about 6,000, 7,000 years old. But they've got to be there. And that's one of the things I think that this work at White Sands has got people thinking more about is looking for documenting tracks in archaeological sites because they gotta be more common than we realize because an archaeological site was created by people, therefore they left tracks. I think that's, if nothing else, that's a great outcome of this work, is to try to get tracks on people's radar because we're just not used to it. So looking for it, but now we are. Well, it's out there. It's caused people to rethink, but it's, they're not easy to see and certainly not easy to preserve. They're pretty delicate.
Hmm. Yeah, sounds like I know there's a couple other basin lakes that they do find prints in, like in Nevada and other places. So definitely, certainly an interesting route to
Oh
pursue.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, all these paleo lake basins, as I said, there's over 100. Those would be really good places to look, and people are looking. I know that some of the folks, the track folks from White Sands, are looking in other places. So presumably there'll be more to come.
Cool. That'll be interesting to see. All right, Vance.
Okay,
Well, thanks again for
sure.
coming on.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again, and I will be looking forward to your email.
Yes, yeah, and good luck with your show. You're doing
Okay,
well.
thanks.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks for the invite. Talk to you later.